In the frozen hills of East Tennessee, during the bleak winter of 1863, war didn't arrive with a cannon blast, came quietly, riding on tired horses, knocking on the door of a grieving widow. Her name was Martha Caldwell. She wasn't a soldier, she didn't carry a rifle. But when Union troops arrived on her doorstep, hungry for food and desperate for information, she gave them something far more powerful than bullets. She gave them fear. It's carefully chosen lies and just enough truth to be believed. Martha reshaped their plans, misdirected their march, and saved her town from the fire that had consumed so many others. This is not the story of generals or battlefield glory. This is the true story of a woman who, with nothing left to lose, changed the course of war, using only her voice. In the winter of 1863, the hills of East Tennessee were quiet, but not peaceful. Snow lay like dust on the ridges, and the trees stood leafless and gray against the sky. He had been a quiet man, a carpenter by trade, who thought the war might pass them by if they just kept their heads down. He was wrong. He was killed in an ambush by Union raiders near the Holston River. They said it was quick, but Martha didn't trust such words. Some, like Martha, kept their loyalties to themselves and tried to survive. Through the bare trees, she spotted the silhouettes of riders, 6, maybe 7 of them. As they drew closer, the blue of their coats became clear. They needed water for their horses, a warm fire, maybe some food, if she had any to spare. He promised they would pay. Union cavalry. Their horses were thin and mud-splattered. Their faces were drawn. These men had been traveling hard. Martha ladled stew into wooden bowls and placed fresh cornbread on the table. The men thanked her and ate quickly. She sat in the corner, knitting, watching them without speaking much. Everyone knew that Armazether's side brought trouble. When soldiers came, they took food, horses, blankets, anything they needed. Soldiers often do, especially when they're tired. They spoke of troop movements, of rebel pickets seen on the ridge, of maps and orders from command. Her mind was sharp, despite the weight of grief. Not for money, not for glory, but for White Hollow. She realized something. These men were afraid. It's not of her or her neighbors, but of what might lie beyond White Hollow. And in their fear, she saw an opportunity. One said they were headed toward Knoxville but feared Confederate resistance along the supply road. Another mentioned how little reliable intelligence they had. Every town, every hill could be hiding an ambush. One of them dismounted. A young lieutenant with a winter scarf pulled up to his chin. Before he could knock, Martha opened the door. Sometimes worse. Then she stepped aside and told them to come in if they meant no harm. She pointed to the well and invited them to sit by the fire. She buried what remained of him near the edge of their land, beneath a cedar tree they had planted together in better days. The war had touched nearly every home in the region by then, including that of Martha Caldwell, a farmer's wife who lived just outside the small community of White Hollow. Martha was 46 years old and recently widowed. Her husband, Joseph Caldwell, had joined a Confederate militia unit the year before, more out of duty than ideology. Since his death, she had worn black every day. She cooked alone, tended to the chickens alone, and read her Bible at night by oil lamp alone. But in that moment, one thing became clear: if she stayed silent, the war would roll through her home like it had through so many others. Her fields might burn, her neighbors might die. She had already lost her husband. She would not lose everything else. Though small and largely forgotten, its location had become important. A supply road ran through the valley nearby, leading toward a Confederate rail junction in Knoxville. Union forces were advancing from the north, hoping to cut off those lines. Confederate troops had passed through the area weeks earlier. Now, rumors said Union scouts were coming. Her neighbors gave her space. Grief had made her distant but not weak. People in White Hollow spoke of her quietly, with a kind of respect. She didn't speak much, but when she did, people listened. White Hollow itself was a poor farming area, a scattering of cabins and barns between wooded hills. By that point in the war, East Tennessee was deeply divided. Some families supported the Union, others had sons in Confederate gray. It was late afternoon when Martha saw the dust rising from the road. They stopped at her front gate. He greeted her politely and explained they were scouting the area. Martha said nothing at first. Inside, they removed their gloves and thawed their fingers, but they talked. Martha listened carefully. She said little, but she was already thinking. She didn't know yet what she would do. That night, as the Union soldiers slept in her barn and the wind howled through the trees outside, Martha Caldwell made a decision. She would lie. Morning came slowly to White Hollow. Fog hung low in the hollows, stretching like gauze across the fields. He was polite, maybe even a little ashamed. He told her their orders were to scout a clear path toward the supply road that led through the valley to Knoxville. They were part of a small detachment sent ahead of the larger Union column still days behind. The Union soldiers woke stiff and sore, their horses already restless in the barn. Martha Caldwell stood at her kitchen table boiling water for coffee. He pointed to ridges and creeks with care, asking if she knew which roads were passable. Martha leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the paper. Martha shook her head slowly, then paused just long enough to make it feel real and said she'd heard a group of Confederate cavalry had dug in a few miles south, near an abandoned church. She didn't greet them with warmth, but she didn't push them out either. The woods beyond White Hollow, he now believed, were full of Confederate pickets. They adjusted their route, deciding to ride north and circle around the valley rather than risk a direct pass. She stood on her porch with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, expressionless. It would take longer, but it was safer. The larger Union force would be notified to delay their advance until further reconnaissance could confirm or deny the widow's warnings. But she had bought time, maybe a day, maybe a week, and in war, time was everything. Snipers, cavalry, maybe even a battery of artillery near the far ridge. None of it was confirmed. But to a tired officer leading a handful of scouts in enemy territory, it was more than enough reason to be cautious. She just returned to her kitchen and began washing the dishes. The young lieutenant, his name was Jonathan Hayes, thanked her again for her hospitality. Neighbors came by that evening curious. They asked what the Yankees had said, what they wanted, what she had told them. Martha was vague, careful. She said little beyond what people expected to hear. But one elderly farmer named Eli Parsons, a man who had fought in the Mexican War, looked her in the eye and asked quietly, "You gave them a scare, didn't you?" Martha listened. She poured coffee into tin cups. Not just to protect herself, but to shape what came next. It wasn't just self-defense anymore. It was strategy. And she knew that once you crossed that line once, you began to act with intention. You became part of the war, whether you wore a uniform or not. She handed them out one by one, her hands steady. Hayes sat at her kitchen table, studying a hand-drawn map with faded ink and smudged lines. She said Confederate scouts had been seen in the woods beyond Milner's Ridge. Just last week, she claimed 2 graycoats had passed through, asking about the lay of the land. Then, for the first time, she spoke more than a few words. She told him the main trail south was rough washed out in the recent rains. It wasn't true. But Hayes didn't know that. No soldiers, no supplies, just broken pews and birds' nests. But her tone was steady, her eyes flat. She didn't offer the story. She let him draw it out of her. That's how the lie worked. He asked if there were any fortified positions nearby. In truth, the church was empty. By the time breakfast was done, Lieutenant Hayes had heard everything he needed or thought he had. Hayes returned to his men and shared what he'd learned. Martha watched them ride off just before noon. The fog had lifted, but the hills still looked pale and distant. The danger was not over, not by a long shot. These men were just scouts. More would come. She knew that. Word of the soldiers' visit spread quickly through White Hollow. Martha didn't answer. That night she lay in bed and thought about what she had done. She had lied. She wasn't a soldier. That didn't mean she wasn't fighting. The next morning brought frost across the fields and silence across the hills. The Union scouts were gone, and for the first time in weeks, White Hollow felt still. She had expected to feel relief after the soldiers left. But instead, she felt the burden of a new role she had stepped into. She had redirected the war's path, if only slightly. But with that shift came something else. Attention. They said they were following up on Lieutenant Hayes' report, seeking confirmation. Martha greeted them with the same steady gaze, the same quiet resolve. But now, the stakes were higher. She had told a line at a passing falsehood, but a crafted piece of fiction designed to move an army, and it had worked. That knowledge changed her. But Martha Caldwell knew better than to trust stillness during a war. It often came just before something broke loose. One part of her story didn't T hold if they saw through the fog of her fiction. Wouldn't T just be her house at risk? Not bold claims, just enough to add weight to her story? She mentioned seeing smoke near the old church again. She described movement in the woods. Shadows, she said. Could have been deer. Could have been worse. It could be her life. There were rumors that the Union had begun hanging civilian informants. He took notes. Lies, she realized, were like threads. If one frayed, the whole thing could unravel. He thanked her for her cooperation. There were also Confederate partisans nearby who would turn on her just as quickly if they thought she was helping the Yankees. "You're very calm, ma'am," he said. "For someone living this close to danger." "I've already lost my husband to this war," she replied. "Fear won't bring him back. In a war like this, truth and loyalty were slippery things." Some said she was working for the Union. Others claimed she had Confederates hiding in her barn. Nobody knew for sure, and Martha gave them no reason to know. She kept to herself, just as she always had. But the truth was more complicated than either side imagined. She spent the early hours mending the fence behind the barn, her mind still racing. He asked fewer questions, but sharper ones. He pointed to her map on the kitchen wall and asked for details. She didn't know if more would come. She didn't know how long the story would hold. She did know this. The web she had begun spinning was growing, stretching across the valley, shaping the decisions of men in tents and on horseback, men who would never know her name. She had seen what the war had taken from both sides. She wasn't fighting for a flag. She was fighting for space, for breathing room, for survival. She made herself appear unsure enough to be believable, but not so unsure that she would be dismissed. Heavy, one of them had a cough. Sounded sick. How many men had she seen? What insignia did they wear? Direction had they come from? And that, for now, was enough. She had not merely protected her home. That same afternoon, a second Union group arrived. Smaller, just 2 officers and a guide. She knew the danger. The lead officer was older, quieter than the young Hayes. Martha answered carefully. She kept her tone level, even hesitant. "I didn't count, sir," she said, "but I remember hearing their boots." She offered small, specific details. The officer listened, expression unreadable. Before he left, he paused at the door and looked back at her. Martha didn't flinch. He gave a slow nod, then stepped out into the cold. That evening, as dusk fell, Martha walked the edge of her land, watching the road. And every time she opened her mouth now, she had to be sure it matched what she'd already said. In town, rumors had started. People whispered that Martha had become a spy. She wasn't working for the Union, and she certainly wasn't loyal to the Confederate cause, not anymore. For the ridge that overlooked her home, for the orchard behind her barn, for the grave where her husband lay, she didn't know how long the lies would hold. But as long as they did, White Hollow would remain untouched. It was 3 days after the second visit when the man who changed everything rode up the hill to Martha Caldwell's house. He came alone in the late afternoon. Just as the sun began to fall behind the ridge and the long winter shadows crept across the fields. He was dressed in a Union officer's coat, though the brass on his shoulders had been dulled by travel. His boots were polished, his face clean-shaven. He didn't look like a man who'd spent time on the front lines. He looked like someone who had studied too many maps and trusted too little of what others told him. Martha invited him in without ceremony. She didn't offer coffee this time. She didn't need to. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence, and approached the door slowly. When Martha opened it, she already knew this man wasn't like the others. He introduced himself simply. Captain Nathaniel Kerrigan, Army of the Cumberland. At one point, he stepped outside without warning and studied the tracks in the dirt. The slope of the road, the line of sight to the ridge. He said he was reviewing intelligence reports and wanted to speak with her personally. "Maybe they moved on," she said. "Or maybe they saw your men and decided to wait." Captain Kerrigan was polite but precise. His questions were sharper, more direct. "Do you know what happens to people who speak the truth and get ignored? They watch their towns burn." He referred to specific statements made by previous officers, details Martha had forgotten she had offered. He asked about footprints she claimed to have seen, about smoke rising from the woods, about the cough of a rebel soldier. But I do know fear makes people see what they want to see. It makes people say what they think will protect them. He spoke like a man comparing a story to a report, waiting for the thread to snap. She hadn't lied out of fear, she told herself. She had lied out of conviction, out of instinct. And that distinction, however small, was the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the weight of it all. And Martha, calm and steady, answered. But as the conversation wore on, she sensed it. He wasn't just trying to confirm her information, he was testing it. Testing her. He stood and walked around her parlor, observing everything. The photograph of her husband, the stack of wood by the hearth, the calendar on the wall. When he returned, he closed the door softly behind him. A reminder that the lies were growing too big to manage, that sooner or later, the web might tear. Then he looked at her and said, I've seen no fresh tracks in the woods. And the war, for now, had been bent ever so slightly around her. No smoke, no scouts. Nothing since our first men came through. Martha didn't flinch. Kerrigan didn't respond, just looked at her for a long time. Then he asked, Do you know what happens to civilians who knowingly give false information to a commanding officer? There it was. The edge of the blade. Martha said nothing at first. Then she set down her shawl and replied. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. Finally, Captain Kerrigan exhaled and said, I don't know if you're lying, Mrs. Caldwell. Then he turned, thanked her for her time, and left. Martha watched him ride down the hill and disappear into the trees, and only then did her hands begin to shake. That night, she stayed up late, trimming the wick of her oil lamp and rereading her husband's last letter. But something had changed. Captain Kerrigan's visit wasn't just about confirming facts. It was a warning. And still, she didn't regret it, because White Hollow was still standing. The road through the valley remained quiet. She had risked everything on a single idea, that a widow's word could shape the choices of armed men. And somehow, so far it had. Winter melted slowly in the hills of East Tennessee. By March, the frost began to lift from the fields. The first shoots of green crept along the base of fence posts and tree roots. Life was returning to the valley, but cautiously, as if nature itself didn't quite trust the quiet. White Hollow was still standing. She spoke little at town gatherings. She avoided attention, but something in her presence had changed. She no longer carried her grief like a stone in her chest. She carried it like a weight she had already learned to bear. The war had passed around it like a river diverted by stone. They said she had scared the Yankees off, that she'd filled their heads with ghost stories and lies. A few called her a hero, a few others called her reckless. But none dared say it to her face. Never left. Never told the full story, not to neighbors, not to anyone.
Ow.
No dispatch named the widow who changed a map. In war, stories like hers tend to fall between the lines. But in a backwater command tent, someone had scribbled a note. Avoid the lower valley near White Hollow, possible enemy activity. High risk. That note was passed up the chain. A safer route was chosen. The town was spared. Sometimes the best thing you can do in war is make men believe what they were already afraid of. The road through the valley remained unscarred by cannon wheels. The old church on the ridge stood silent and empty. Union advance had slowed, then shifted. Commanders had opted for safer ground, more visible terrain. Sitting outside the general store one afternoon, he said, Martha Caldwell fought the war without lifting a musket. She fought it with silence, with memory, and with a voice that sounded like truth. But by a widow on a hill, with nothing left to lose, and just enough courage to lie, the maps had changed. And though no one said it aloud, some in White Hollow began to suspect who had made that happen. Martha Caldwell said nothing. She went on as she always had, tending the chickens, mending clothes, hauling water from the well. The orchard behind the barn bloomed again. The ridge grew over with pine and bramble. Her husband's grave remained untouched. The cedar tree above it now twice as tall, neighbors speculated, because deep down they understood what she had done. One Manili Parsons, the old veteran, summed it up best. Of course, no official record ever mentioned her, that was all. Years later, long after the war ended and peace had returned in its uneasy, ragged form, Martha Caldwell still lived in the same house. She never remarried. Only once, near the end of her life, did she say anything that hinted at it. A young school teacher had asked her during a church gathering if it was true that she had once spoken to Union soldiers during the war. Martha looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, and that was all. Today, there's no statue for Martha Caldwell, no plaque in White Hollow. But her story passed down in whispers, half memory and half truth lives on. Because not every battle is fought with guns. Not every hero is written into history books. Sometimes the tide of war is turned not by generals or cannons. Thanks for watching this untold story from the Civil War. If you found it powerful, imagine how many more voices history almost forgot. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to us, Civil War History, for more hidden stories from America's past. New episodes every week. See you in the next one.